Good, thanks very much. I wanted to do this because Anil's an extremely good friend of mine. I just wanted 2 minutes to introduce him as he trots off into the sunset in terms of his career in clinical practice. Let me just tell you a little bit about Anil. He was born in India, and I think his initial education was in India, but he then came over to the UK and he graduated and trained down in London, but very quickly went into academia through the 80s and early 90s, and he was supported by both the MRC and the Wellcome for many of his earlier years before becoming an established lecturer and then senior lecturer here in Dundee, ultimately getting his readership back in 2005. So he's had a distinguished track record in terms of academia, and I just wanted to highlight the kind of main areas. I think Anil does have significant productions around basic science, and I think he will touch on that in his talk. I don't know anything about it. Phosphorylation, gates, channels, he talks about it all the time. But he also, interestingly, bridges the gap between basic science and clinical practice, and has more recently been involved in some kind of big data work, looking at huge data sets, collecting data from not just Scotland, not just the UK, but most recently from across Europe. And again, I think he's going to touch on his work in cystic fibrosis registries and genomics in his talk. I didn't think it was fair to comment on Anil's academic career without touching on his teaching. Anil, I think, certainly within paediatrics, is renowned for his teaching. And I think it's important to kind of take a broad view of teaching, in that teaching isn't just about getting across facts. And indeed, I think if teaching was about getting across facts, most of us would be completely confused by Anil. Teaching, I think, is about getting people to think. And the one thing that Anil does is he gets people to think. He may confuse you, he may raise ideas that you don't agree with, but he is enormously influential at getting students, colleagues, and others to actually think about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and to go away and ponder. And I think that's one of Anil's biggest attributes that we've experienced, certainly in paediatrics. Just a couple of his highlights, which I thought were worthwhile picking out, some more light-hearted than others. Again, a practical clinician, and Anil was in fact one of the first, if not the first, to design what's now recognised as one of the common modes of ventilation in neonatology, a trigger ventilator. Anil built that with a colleague back in 1986 and then went on to win the MRC prize for bioengineering. He's had advisory roles, largely I think related to his registry work and epidemiology around cystic fibrosis. Again, not just in UK and Europe, but also across in the United States and with the World Health Organization. Again, illustrating Anil's passion for teaching, I lifted this title of one of his talks from a few years ago, and I think this illustrates exactly what I mean about encouraging people to think and being provocative. The title, "Why Don't Hibernating Squirrels Die of Pneumonia?" has to start asking questions of everybody when they read that. And that was my favourite from his long list of teaching and academic outputs that he provided with his CV. So, ladies and gentlemen, it does give me great pleasure to ask Anil to come and tell us a little bit about his work over the years. He's been a friend, a colleague. He's a physician, a scientist, a teacher, philosopher. He's definitely a maverick, and he won't mind me saying he is at times a pain in the butt.
Thank you, Peter.
Dr. Anil Mehta.
Well, how do you top that, really? Okay, so let's start here. I came to Dundee in 1990, and my interview panel asked me that question. And I said, well, it'll all be signals, taps on the shoulder, knives in the back, I don't know what, right? So this was the signals. Now the thing is, when you cross 50, you get this question asked of you. Does your left hand talk to your right hand? Now, of course, that's not the direct question you get asked. Actually, this lands on your... And any of you who've ever done this test, I really think that it's a kind of copro choreography, you know? So what you have to do is really rename this test, because I've been screening for cystic fibrosis for years, and uptake is the key. And this one has to be one of the low ones for uptake, I think. So I think it's misnamed. So anybody that sees Bob Steele next, I think you should just call it Poetry in Motion. So that, you ignore that at 50, but when this thing lands on you, and you get something called an ITSO number, then you know you're literally your numbers are up, because Big Brother can track you at this point. Because this ITSO, this is a smart card, and if you use it and it gets logged, they know where you are. So these are real problems, really. So when you get these kind of numbers, you don't know what they mean. I mean, that's not my age, you know, but it's a number that tracks me. So everybody has a number in this room, lots of numbers, so people know who you are. Now, when I read this statement, as every one of you in bold knows this statement if you do medicine, right? But you're not expected to know this bit. But you know that bit. And then you look at it, and when you actually look at it, and you enter this field by accident, because I won this award, and the award had a fellowship, and the fellowship's title was really, go invent a new box to think inside of. You've made a new box, you've made a ventilator, go and do something else, right? And that's what happened to me. And I want you just to read this with me. There is a gene, it's on chromosome 7. It's got a common allele that causes the disease. Almost all patients have 1 or 2 copies. And it deletes 1 amino acid in frame out of 1,480. So the stupid ribosome hasn't a clue, it just deletes this in frame and just carries on making this protein. And that intrigued me. I have to say that totally fascinated me that was the case. And that was because when I entered the University of Oxford, I had to write an essay on cogito ergo sum. And Henry Chadwick, the very reverend, now late, but sitting somewhere on the right-hand side of God right now, looking down on us, said to me, he said, it's absolutely useless, this essay you've written. And he made me go away and read a proper set of background and rewrite it. Okay? And that came in really useful, because when Karen, my cystic fibrosis patient, died, she had 2 copies of this common allele before reaching puberty, and her sister is still alive and is now herself a mother. That made no sense to that first statement that it was an autosomal recessive disease. So £3,000 for a laptop in 1993, laptops were brand new then, that allowed me to go around collecting data. And the problem was this, that even if you were monozygous twins, or if you were siblings, as in Karen's case, you could have as much as a 20%, even if you translate this from the French, you can see is 20% difference in lung function between children from the same family with the same delta F allele. So that made no sense at all to me, and I wanted to investigate it, and that's what I chose to do. So I said to Jim and Shirley that I didn't tell them anything about new drugs or anything. I didn't know anything in the 1990s about this sort of stuff. What I said to them was this. I said, we need to understand to common definitions what on earth we're talking about in this disease. Because if the language of the definitions is not the same, we're not talking about the same thing, it's just not right. And the reason I thought about that was this. I was fortunate to be taught 1 hour a week by the late Anthony Stradling, who would have got the Nobel Prize for graphene if he hadn't died. 1 hour a week in front of Anthony, where you had to explain how to make an electron go where it didn't want to go. In front of Jack Payton, who grew up in Tayside, in Tayport, explaining how this happened, and Jack's fantastic lecture series. So when I entered medicine, having done all that, I was really very surprised by medicine. And what I decided to do was make, for patient benefit, one kind of approach to the problem. And the approach is this. There's what the real world is like, as Jack used to say, Jack Payton, what you can model of that world, and the minus is the key. And the minus, he used to tell me, can only be filled if you fill it with the second law of thermodynamics. You can't go outside the second law to bridge this gap. Now, when I did this, what I was trying to do was to make one record that collected all this information about a cystic fibrosis patient. And look how long it took. It was in 2014, before working with lots of colleagues, this was even possible to get it live. In the 1990s, all we could do was one paper record, which was distributed all over Britain, having been piloted in Scotland. So the net result was, and if you have a smartphone with you and you go to this site here, you'll see it all documented in great detail. The net result was this. That because there was this amazing guy called Ken Robertson who introduced me to all this stuff, because he used to go around collecting this sort of data in diabetes. So Ken then left and went off to Glasgow and kind of left me with this problem of trying to sort this out. And so we wrote and published a whole series of standards. And everything was going really, really well. And I decided that I'd take a holiday. Now, this is February, and it's not in Dundee. Now, there's several clues here. So there's flowers, and there's a beautiful swing, and sunshine, and blue sky, and there's a lovely golf course, and that's me trying to hit a golf ball. And then all this. This is in the south of India. This is the family home. And I was there, and it was everything was great, and it was fantastic, and it was a lovely holiday. And then not along came a spider, but along came a rider with a telegram, because we were miles from anywhere. It takes 2 days to get there. And the telegram was really bad news. And the bad news was this, that Ken had gone and the team had resigned. The telegram said, team are off, we've all disappeared off. So I felt a bit like, Dad's army, walking around going, don't panic, what's happening here? So I spoke to my wife, who's an IT expert, and I said to her, Gita, would you please look after the team for a few months, get it all sorted, and then we'll hire some new people? And she said, sure. And she said, well, send the CV to Richard Olver. So Richard Olver took a look at the CV, and his response was really interesting. His response was, if I'd known that this CV existed in 1990, I'd have appointed her and not you. So Gita arrived, and she took command of the team, and she corralled the CF physicians and paediatricians of Scotland, then the UK, and then Europe. And if you look at this website, you can see her work. And what she told me was, always hire people much cleverer than you, which is very straightforward. So we got these people, and the work made the cover of the Lancet. So what I want to show you is what we found. What Gita's skill is that she knows what people want, and she knows what technology can do, and she can bridge the gap. And that's what she'd done before she joined medicine. She was every time you go to Google Maps and you put in and you see the map coming up, Gita digitized the entire UK maps from Ordnance Survey. So that's the kind of things she used to do before she did medicine, before she joined me. And so she took command of this. And Donald McGregor now comes into the picture. See? Now, once again, the bowel screening test comes in. Now, I have no idea whether he took this test with him when he was at the American Thoracic Society, but he was in a slightly indisposed position. And he sent me an email at the meeting. He said, Anil, I was sitting indisposed when two gentlemen came into the urinal and I overheard the following conversation. Did you hear that presentation? Did you see that data? He said, yeah. He says, it's the best in the world. He says, who is this guy? He says, oh, I don't know, he just plays golf in St Andrews. And they left. He has no idea who they were, but he sent that. So the quality of the data, and it was the people that created the data. So let me give you two examples. So there were all these 30,000 patients, 22 countries. There's now 50,000 patients on this registry, and we analyzed this data. So I'm going to just show you two examples. One is newborn screening for cystic fibrosis, and the other one is politics. Okay? So Erica Sims joined the team. Absolutely outstanding investigator. And what Erica did was she took 184 newborn screened children under the age of 7 and 950 clinically diagnosed controls, age matched them, and made the nominal 100 graph. So imagine there's 100 kids here, right? And what she found was that if you look at the newborn screen group, 50%, 50 of those 100 were costing less than $500 in drugs to treat per year. And then what she found was that 75% were costing about $5,000 per year, right? But when she looked at the clinically diagnosed group, they were all right-shifted. So that here you can see 50% of clinically diagnosed group were costing $5,000 and so on and so on. It was always a right shift till you got up here. And that really caught people's attention. And that's why it made the cover of The Lancet, because we were able, the first time, to be able to show quantitatively what was going on. Then Jonathan McCormick joined the team. And Jonathan did the most exciting thing in terms of political impact of what was going on here. Jonathan designed this in the following way. This is a percentage change graph, and he divided the population into these age bands. So he lumped all the under 10s. And if there was no change in the population size, this thing would just follow this zero line. But you can see the population size went up. And then there was no change in the population size, because this is at 0, and then the population size declined, percentage on the previous band plot. But what Jonathan noticed was that those members of the European Union who'd arrived in 2004, there was a decline immediately after the first 10 years, left shifted from there. So they couldn't make the diagnosis and there was very little newborn screening in those days, so this was all clinical diagnosis. They couldn't make the diagnosis, and the patients were dying quickly. And so that gave us the first insight into what was going on across Europe. And that attracted the attention of the newborn screeners. It attracted the attention of the European Parliament and the European Commission. And even in Germany, where they were absolutely against newborn screening because of their past during the war, anything to do with DNA, genetic screening was just absolutely out. We were able to use the registry approach to say, look, 1/3 of the patients across Europe are unable to take a walk and they're more breathless on hills and stairs. The others cannot even walk on their own at their level pace behind their contemporaries, and we can fix this using screening and using the new drugs which I'm about to tell you about. So the screening aspect really took off And now I'm pleased to be able to tell you the Americans invited us over. We went to CDC Atlanta, put our evidence on the table. The American states took it on. Every state now screens. It's all over Europe. And there's very few countries now that don't screen. And Germany is the last, I think, coming online. I'm going to switch tack now. This is what my fellowship was for. To use the fact that in this room, 1 in 25 of you carry that on one allele. And the new drugs. During the time of the registry, I wrote this paper, and I want to try and explain why I wrote it and what this CK2 stuff is. And I'm afraid, once again, the bowel screening test comes in. But this time it's far more serious. Because now, 2 things happen to patients with cystic fibrosis that are really strange. Children get bowel cancer, rarely. Young adults get bowel cancer in their 30s, rarely. And some young children have a pinhole bowel, it fibroses, rarely. So, when we wrote this up, immediately it was picked up by other people, and it's cited as an early paper. Why CK2? What the heck is going on here? Suppose I give you something that you've never seen before. So if you're a Neanderthal and I give you a wheel, you don't know what the hell a wheel is. You live in a world without a wheel, and I give you a wheel. It's a new shape. It's a new thing in your life. Okay? Now, let's suppose there's a forward action. There is this thing, this shape, which controls the ion channel that forms from the protein CFTR, which is encoded by the gene. And we found that CK2 controls this, and I'll come back to that later on. But what's the wheel argument here? You've lost one amino acid out of 1,480. And in the region where this mutation takes place, you've created a new shape into humanity. This is folding in an origami kind of way into a new shape. And what we found was that that new shape happened to fit exactly into a side part of CK2. So what we discovered was that there was a knock-in mutation, that this mutation in the cystic fibrosis protein had a function in the autosomal recessive condition, in the heterozygote. So all of you in this room that carry it have a different way of controlling the enzyme CK2 compared to the rest of you. Okay? So keep that in your head for a moment, because it's quite a difficult concept to get across. You see, recently it's been found that 1.2% of your DNA is Neanderthal. But it's not the same 1.2% in everybody in this room. And recent estimates put the humanity as having 40% at a maximum of eclectic Neanderthal codes. Now, if you go back to Milan in AD 50, the Franks invaded. What they did was the Franks killed all the men in Milan. And they took over the generation of the next generations in Milan. If you think about the Vikings in Iceland, the longboats didn't have any women on, so when they arrived and set their settlements up, they went to the island and stole the women from there and took them up to Iceland. Boko Haram, we know what they do. This has been going on, I think, this is a characteristic of humanity. And I think it went on here as well. That's just me saying that. So now imagine that this lecture theatre has got 3 kilometres of ice above it. And we go back 10,000 years. And there's an ice wall that goes from the other side of Ireland right the way through across to Norway. There's 3 kilometres of ice that's taken away the sea levels. They've dropped below the Straits of Gibraltar. And the Mediterranean is a puddle. And Sardinia is a hill. Okay? And then all of a sudden, the ice wall collapses. And the channel floods. And we have Brexit 1. Okay? And then, around that time, you've also got to remember that humans had domesticated the wolf just a few thousand years before. By rebreeding from wolf, they made the dog, hunting dog. Wheat had not yet doubled its number of chromosomes and acquired a second mutation to become fertile, and wouldn't do so for another 5,000 years in and around Erbil in Kurdistan. Okay? So that's all yet got to happen. Now, imagine all that's happening, and those standing stones you see if you go to Skye and keep going to the Outer Isles, there's those standing stones found in the peat bog. They were just being built, and the following happened. On chromosome 7, a single baby, lost 3 base pairs. Now, this is phenylalanine 508. This is the code for it. It didn't lose TTT. No. This baby went and lost those 3 in a 1A, CTT, straddling these 2 amino acids. So that's amazing. You've got billions of places to lose 3 amino acids. You happen to lose them inside a gene. That's one amazing thing. Second amazing thing which struck me when this was discovered was that you needed also the fact that ATT and ATC both code for isoleucine. So you had to have the right tRNA combination and the wobble hypothesis, if you remember from your biochemistry. So that's the second coincidence. And then, is it surprising that this happened only once in humanity? Of course it's not surprising. That's a pretty rare event. And it happened just at the time those standing stones were being put down on the other side of Skye, on the Outer Isles. So, what's going on? If this happened once in one baby, how come today it's 1 in 25 people in this room? Therefore, since 3 out of 4 children died and never transmitted their genes from various diseases, it follows that 25% that survived became the next, and so on and so on and so on, that the delta F508 mutation must have been protective against the common causes of childhood death in some way, shape or form. And that is how you get to 1 in 25 today. So what did I know at the time? Well, all I knew was Robin Smith was working with me at that time, and he knew that the hibernating squirrels that were talked about earlier, if you're at 32 degrees centigrade, you have 10 hertz of ciliary beat frequency in nasal brush biopsies, which drops down to 5, and you can elevate that back to normal by either turning on the cyclic AMP amplifier or turning off the 4-ball ester system. The details are not important. The point is this. Robin's work pointed me to the following, that he had discovered a link between the beta agonist control of the airway and the anticholinergic signal. And my son or my daughter was playing with their jack-in-the-box. And as they were playing and they were pressing the button and it went up like a concertina, it suddenly struck me that CK2 was doing something similar to calmodulin as the explanation. And the reason I thought that was that calmodulin is a calcium-binding protein that sits like that, and when CK2 phosphorylates it, it springs apart and binds calcium. The rest of the time it's closed, and it's not calmodulin at all. And that was really important from all the work that was going on. And as soon as I saw that, I started to take these cells, and this is where I need to just dim the lights for a second. Whoops. Is that going down? Right. Here are the cilia. This is a stain for the cystic fibrosis protein in red, and if the CK2 is within a few nanometers away of this CFTR, and the CK2 is in green, you should see yellow. Can you all see the yellow? Yeah? Now, if you look in this cystic fibrosis patient, there is no localization of CK2 at all. Now, you expect there to be no CFTR because losing that F508 makes the protein unstable and it falls apart. So we were expecting this result. We were not expecting this result. These were stained at the same time. It made no sense unless there was a really important interaction between these two proteins that was relevant to its accumulation in the membrane. So We then went and showed unequivocally in cell patches, airway, pancreatic duct, mice, and even putting it into frogs' eggs, that CK2 was absolutely essential to let the channel work. Okay? And then something very interesting happened. Having done this work, we then decided that this is where the F508 mutation is. This is the channel. So this is the apical membrane. There are the cilia. I've expanded this up. And so the way to think about this is imagine this is the thumb hold of a pair of scissors, and these are the finger holds. And you get these bits out of the way and this tail out of the way, and as you squeeze these two together, it's a reverse scissors, this opens. And the chloride goes in and out. Okay? So what we did was we made antibodies, and Jack Reardon, who discovered this, gave me his private collection of antibodies that he doesn't give to anybody, which was absolutely fantastic of Jack. And he gave me antibodies to here, different antibodies to here, different antibodies to here, and the tail and the end terminus and all that. I won't show you all that. What I will show you is this. That I got a warning signal, you see, from Henry Chadwick. Everybody believed this to be true. And so what I did was I asked a really talented person, Kendra Tassoni, with other people in the lab to test the hypothesis. Now, if this was a real model, then the size of this, if I have an antibody to this and an antibody to that, they should give me identically sized proteins. Well, here's the antibody to that one. And you can see you get a pattern like that, and never mind the individual lanes, look at the pattern overall. Does that look like that to you? No. And that means that this F508 region here is being cut and is giving you small bands. Something is splitting this protein in the membrane and giving you these funny bands down here. Now, why is that important? It means that this region here, which is tucked away and cannot be accessed, is actually available to the cell. And as soon as we saw that, we knew we were onto something really interesting. And this is it. And this is the take-home message. People are put off by biochemistry, right? So I'm going to translate this to you. This is the region, this is the amino acids that live around that corner there. So you have a Peugeot 508 GTI, PGTI, right? Driven by a boy called Kenneth, who's the governor of a little girl called Sadie, who's 2 years old. And 1 in 25 of you in this room, cousin Kenny, because this has been deleted, is driving Sadie around. Okay? Now, if you keep that in your mind's eye, SYDE is a dead ringer to attract CK2. So if I put this into a cell system, this thing should get phosphate on it, and this thing should phosphorylate like stink. And when I sent it to the guy who's been doing this experiment for 40 years, Lorenzo Pinna, he sent me a message in capital letters. What poison have you sent me for my kinase? What did he mean by that? He said, when he put this into his kinase assay, to look for phosphate here, he got the most ridiculous result he'd ever seen in his life. And he said, look, this is an experiment he ran. If Kenneth and Kenny, without the F, were doing the same thing to the kinase, and we call whatever happens to the kinase 1, then this line should stay as yellow, the yellow line. But when you add Kenny as opposed to Kenneth, what you see is Kenny gives you between 7 and 20-fold stimulation to some substrates and inhibition to other substrates. So what Enzo said to me was, this is an allosteric controller of my kinase, and nobody has ever described that before. And we must work together and get on and try and sort out what's going on. The implication was the function of hundreds of proteins was going to be misregulated by the presence of this Kenny peptide. It's like having an internet router that's sending you spam mail all over the place. And that is why cells with cystic fibrosis are so badly disrupted. So that was the challenge that Lorenzo Pinna and others put in about 5 years ago. Can we return these tower blocks to the yellow line? Okay? And I was doing these experiments and raising the money and talking to the funders. Stuart Gordon died of cystic fibrosis. These are his parents. They've supported me for 20 years. Lorenzo Pinna spent millions doing CK2 work and so on. This is Jim and Shirley, I told you at the beginning. And I was doing all this, and I was at a meeting, and I was approached by this guy, Luigi Maiori. He said, I read all your work. It's fantastic, but it'll never work. He says, you've forgotten something. And the thing that I had forgotten, which we were just going into with Kate and other people, which we just published one paper on, he said, I read your paper, but we're way ahead of you. Let's join up. Let's not be competitors. What he had discovered was that cystic fibrosis mice that have the delta F5 mutation die, and we knew this, by 6 weeks, half of them are dead. But he discovered a drug that stopped that happening, called cysteamine. And so what he said to me was, this condition called autophagy, where the Nobel Prize was awarded this year, is blocked in this condition, and cysteamine reverses the block. So what he said was, let's find a medicine together. And working with Andrea, Giorgio, and our very own Kendra sitting over there, this is what we found. A medicine that would block CK2, that would work in conjunction with cysteamine to reverse the effects of cystic fibrosis. So drug 1 unblocks the autophagic road, drug 2 resets the kinase. Together they work really, really well. So we did the first 10 patients, and we reversed the sweat test down towards the magic number of 60. If I do a sweat test in all of you, you'll have a number around 20, 30, 40, 50 at the most. Patients with cystic fibrosis have numbers in the hundreds, or 90 or 80. And we managed to get this down towards 60. And rather than bore you with all the details, I'm going to tell you a story. So I got an email from a physician, and he had a boy aged 5 at this weight, and he had asked me for advice on how to treat this child. So I said, try this. So this is contemporary. 1st of October to 7th of October, the sweat chloride went up from its original value, and we were really perplexed why this was happening. But what happened next was really interesting. He sent me an email saying, look, the new sweat test is 60. Never happened before. And there was no change on the 8th to the 14th of October in the symptoms. And then I was getting depressed, and then he said, hey, cysteamine ECG is doing something. His cough is getting more wet, appetite has increased. This is what we saw in the trial of 40 patients that we'd done. So in summary, ladies and gentlemen, what I've tried to do is go around this loop from the first ever baby, fibrogenicum, mucogenicum, whoever it was, kynogenicum. Through all these things, I've tried to get you to see what I've been doing in Dundee for the last quarter century. And you can't do it without your friends. Peter has become a great friend, as many people sitting there in paediatrics who've supported me over the years in the ear, nose and throat department, in anesthetics and so on, to get the biopsies and do the work. If you look at this lady here, she's a Cockney, and she got a first-class honours in zoology, and she cycled around the world, and she came back to my lab. He's a Zambian farmer's son who went to Alexandria and got the highest marks in the university and came to work with me. And many, many other people. And Richard and David, who protected my back when others wanted to destroy what I was doing. I thank them all. I thank you all for listening. And I have one piece of information for you. The real world is nasty. There's lots of engineering tools available, and the gap you have to shrink. That's what you should be doing. Okay? But I point this out to you. I have now accepted a chair in another institution. It goes with this table, and it goes with this wonderful little creature here. And it's a very comfortable chair. And I'm going to be devoting my time to the interest on the capital. And I really recommend this because it's a fantastic thing to do. At the same time, we're launching the clinical trial of the new therapy, placebo-controlled, and we're raising the money to do that. And I thank you for your attention.